is private equity collapsing yet? Late last week, the industry publicly reported its second largest loss ever.
Thoma Bravo lose all of the $5 billion it invested in Medallia as it hands the software group to lenders. Man, they are having a bad time. Good.
Credit markets that finance all the debt-fueled speculation have seen massive withdrawals over liquidity concerns. A Bain Capital European loan tranche defaulted for the first time since 2008. Investor payouts have slowed to a multi-decade low, also not seen since the global financial crisis. People can't pull their money out fast enough. The few public assets that we do have information on are down by as much as 30% at the same time the broader market is up by the same amount.
Yeah, private equity, emphasis on private. So, no real way to track a lot of these things, and they kind of prefer to keep it that way. Thank you for the hydrate and stretch, Harold.
And the number of unsold companies acquired by these firms has
private equity firms sitting on a 9-year backlog. Backlog. 9 years. That's mental.
ballooned to over 32,000. It clearly doesn't sound great, but
No.
At the same time, last year the industry supposedly had its second best year ever, which kind of makes me look like a bit of an idiot, right? Private equity firms made almost $1 trillion in new acquisitions and perhaps more importantly, sold over $700 billion worth of businesses, which was only ever surpassed by 2021 when interest.
This man right here. This man is so cursed. Jim Cramer. He may as well be the Sonichu medallion of financial commentators. When he starts saying nice things about your company, run.
Rates were significantly cheaper. But this does raise the obvious question of, how can both of these reports be true at the same time?
Well, while it is possible for both of them to be true at the same time, one of them could be complete and total bullshit. And it's probably this one over on the left.
Were the naysayers, myself included, just wrong about this industry? Or was 2025 something of a going out of business sale? Wrong about this industry? Or was 2025 something of a going out of business sale?
Sachs, Neiman Marcus, and Bergdorf Goodman filing for bankruptcy. Never thought I'd see the day. Blue came in because he's curious. Welcome in, Blue.
70% of the nation's nursing homes are now owned by for-profit companies.
Oh, I'm sure that won't end in disaster for anyone. I'm sure that won't lead to a massive uptick in elder abuse. Yeah, I'm sure the same industry that is probably more than likely committed to massive amounts of DEI hiring. No, I'm sure we won't have a gigantic uptick in allegations and footage coming out of Granny and Gramps getting the shit beaten out of them by Nurse Shaniqua or whatever. Yeah, I'm sure that's not going to happen.
Getting into dentistry, how many losses there are so far throughout the private equity and private credit spaces?
Over time, if a liquidity issue is extended, it can turn into a credit issue.
Cascade Capital Group and its affiliate Legacy Healthcare bought the nursing home.
A group led by Blackstone has agreed to take control of software group Medallia.
God, what an evil fucking company. BlackRock, is just pure evil. Blackstone, they're a close second.
From Thoma Bravo in a deal that will cement one of the largest wipeouts in the history.
Okay, so I have obviously been very critical of this industry in the past, mostly because of the perverse incentives it gives financiers to enshittify products, lay off workers, and separate themselves from the consequences. But also partially because it's just not a good business model. It's structured from the ground up to slowly eat itself while paying out huge bonuses for the privilege. So yeah, late last month.
Yeah, the private equity is really not much different from the old corporate raiders of yesteryear. They come in, they take quality products, swap them out with something shittier, try to pass them off as the same quality product, gaslight everybody over that, cut corners everywhere, liquidate as much as they can down to the paper clips, lay off as many people as possible, then they take their big payoffs and they fuck off to do it all over again somewhere else.
Thoma Bravo, a major private equity firm, publicly announced the industry's second biggest loss ever. Medallia was, and still is, a profitable, albeit boring business that makes software to track consumer feedback from online reviews and those little faces you poke when leaving a shop. You know how companies are always collecting your data from your smart fridge for some reason?
Does anyone actually do that? Any of you in chat, those little kiosks or those panels on the walls that got the happy face and the sad face, do any of you ever press those stupid things? Can any of you be bothered to do anything with those?
Medallia is one of the programs they feed that data into to try to sell you stuff more effectively. Thoma Bravo acquired this business using a combination of their investors' money and an additional estimated $1.8 billion in private credit loans coming from other big names in the space like KKR, Apollo, and Blackstone. After the acquisition, the company took on even more debt, and then when interest rates rose, it took on more debt again to maintain its interest payments.
Yeah, that's not good. Chat, if a company is borrowing money just to service their debts, that's bad. That's bad. That means they're on the verge of going out of business. That means they're not making any money. I mean, it's bad enough when an individual does that, which in the short term, yeah, might work. Long term, nah. Eventually you max out. Eventually people stop giving you money for that sort of thing, and you go bust. Me and my brothers pressed them on our way out, always, and a lot pretty quickly. I figured you might do something like that, Harold. You do it as a bit of trolling. You do a bit of trolling.
As a shock to absolutely nobody, this was not sustainable, and just over a week ago, it was announced that the company would be handed over to its debtors, and that the original private equity firm in this whole arrangement would recognize a loss for the full $5 billion it had initially invested. Now, the weird part is that the Medallia business itself is still profitable. It still has a long list of clients, and if it wasn't for all of
and yet Thoma Bravo was borrowing just to service the debt, even though Medallia was making money. But we can either sum up what Thoma Bravo was doing as titanic stupidity or sheer malice. I'm thinking it's more in the territory of malice.
The debt that the private equity company had piled onto it, it would still be making a decent amount of money. Thoma Bravo also wasn't short on cash. They could have just paid off this debt and kept the company, but they instead just decided to write it off entirely and hand the keys over to their lenders to make it their problem. This is
which may have been what KKR, Blackstone, and Apollo wanted the whole time. Thoma Bravo being set up to become a sort of almost like a fall guy. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Those sorts of people at those companies, they talk to each other. They talk to each other all the time. And it would not surprise me in the slightest if it wasn't just some sort of scheme cooked up between the two of, between all of them to acquire Medallia for cheap.
Literally the equivalent of someone putting 80% down on an investment property that is cash flow positive, borrowing 20% to complete the purchase, and then letting the bank foreclose on the house as soon as interest rates went up on their adjustable rate mortgage.
It doesn't make any sense.
Dumb, but it does kind of go to show that this industry isn't really behaving what you might call normally at the moment. And there are 3 reasons why stuff like this is happening at the same time that, on the surface at least, business is as good as ever. The first reason is that 2025 was a little bit of a rush for the exits. On the top line, the year was the second biggest for private equity ever. Exit value hit $717 billion, which is up 47% on 2024. And that sounds very impressive. But when you look at how that number was achieved, there are some problems. Deal count actually fell 6% to 3,018 total exits, which meant this growth was achieved by pushing the average deal size to a record $1.2 billion. And that average is being dragged up by a handful of absolutely enormous transactions. Just 13 of those sales accounted for almost a third of all transactions in total, and without them, the industry would indeed still be shrinking. The largest of these deals was the $55 billion Electronic Arts take private, led by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which, to be clear, was a sovereign wealth fund buying a video game company with the assistance of some private equity partners. A lot of the small to middle market companies that have sort of defined this industry, like the dentist offices, the plumbing companies, the regional healthcare chains, the YouTube channels, those are still struggling to find buyers. 2025 was also the first year interest rates came down meaningfully.
Yeah, because for a lot of them, the business model, it's either money loser or it's not projecting the returns that they're wanting. I mean, some of these things that he was talking about, investing in blue-collar services, medical clinics, doctors and dentist offices, that sort of thing. Yeah, you could potentially make money off of those things. Is it going to be explosive stratospheric growth like what you see with SpaceX going public? No, of course not. No, this is more of the slow and steady sort of thing, potentially. Nothing's guaranteed, of course, but it's just not as sexy. And maybe that's the thing, we've kind of run out of sexy new investments. We've had AI around for a while now, and that was touted as the big new thing. Well, what's the next big new thing? Well, we don't know.
Which allowed a lot of funds to borrow again to shuffle their inventory of companies around. Again, this really is just someone flipping real estate investments. Even if they can manage their interest payments, selling activity tends to pick up when interest rates are lower because sellers know that buyers can borrow more to fund their purchases. The only difference is that instead of trading people's homes back and forth, they are trading people's livelihoods. On the almighty Excel spreadsheet, they are both just cash flow generating assets that are easy to get loans on. Anyway, another big factor was that the regulatory environment also softened considerably. The FTC restarted early termination of merger reviews and granted over 100 requests by mid-2025. The new chairman of the commission, Andrew Ferguson, publicly said the agency must get out of the way quickly. So basically, in 2025, for the first time in 3 years, funds had cheaper money and less regulatory friction. And a lot of them saw this as their chance to offload their winners and make...
That can be bad for competition. And just to keep a sort of macro perspective on things, chat, most mergers and acquisitions don't really go as well as expected. In fact, I would dare say, on the whole, most M&A deals end up failing somehow, or they end up being kind of a negative for the companies that merge or the one that acquires the other. Never really works out as intended.
Major acquisitions while the window is open. Now, to play devil's advocate a bit, this was probably the correct call for these investment firms. But the big rush for the exit did create the image of activity that was really just making up for lost time. Even before the recent news, there were some, inconvenient details underneath. The one metric that was not making up for lost time was realized profits. Actualized payments back to investors who, theoretically want a return on their investments remained extremely low.
Makes sense. You invest money into something, you do so in the hopes of getting it back and then some.
Distributions as a percentage of net asset value stayed flat at 14% in 2025, a level not seen since 2008 and 2009 during the actual global financial crisis. And this was back at a time when the industry was considerably smaller overall, and they have now lagged historical averages for 4 straight years running, which is a new record for the modern PE industry. So the industry was reporting huge exit values, while barely paying anyone back. Now, maybe you could argue...
So, a lot of people at the top getting the big payouts, but the investors aren't getting their return. Raiders, welcome in. Spider Bro, good to see you. Raiders, if it's your first time here, I'm Lord Rexworth. I'm an English nobleman VTuber. We're reacting to some financial videos, including one from How Money Works about private equity. They're not having such a good time lately. How's your stream? I think you were doing another episode of Yap and Chill. Get you some shout-outs here over on the Twitch side. Yeah, doing some just chatting. Excellent. Everyone make sure you go follow Spider Bro. Yes, thank you so much for the raid. Welcome in, Raiders. If any of you need to raid and run, totally understand. Do exercise the normal after-stream care. Get up and stretch, grab something to eat, something to drink, and then kick back and relax with us as we explore how private equity is, well, they've kind of had it, haven't they?
That all of this was getting reinvested. Except that the number of new funds successfully raising capital has basically halved over the last 4 years. If the industry was really firing on all cylinders, this...
Except they're not. Less of them are raising funds. So yeah, it's like a downward trend here. Big uptick around 2020, 2021. Gosh, I wonder what was happening in the world when that was going on. And then it all just came downhill. Well, in a way, back to reality.
Probably shouldn't be happening. A lot of that record-setting exit volume was also just private equity funds trading companies to other private equity funds, which inflates both the...
What did we just get through looking at, chat, with the tech bros? Tech bros passing the same billions of dollars around to each other, and wouldn't you know it, private equity selling assets to each other. Basically the same thing. They're all just playing one big game of pass the parcel.
Acquisition number and the exit number simultaneously. This always happens a bit, but 2025 saw a massive uptick. Secondary transactions hit a record $226 billion, with continuation vehicles alone reaching $115 billion.
It's almost like they have to show activity, and this is the only way they know how, because nothing else is working anymore. And if they stop doing that, the whole thing just comes crashing down.
53% on the prior year. Now, like a lot of things in this industry, that probably needs a bit of de-jargoning. Private equity funds are supposed to have finite lives, usually 10 to 12 years. During that time, a private equity firm will launch the fund.
Yeah, but when you're making millions, even billions of dollars hand over fist, do you really want to cut off that gravy train? Do you really want to bring that to a stop somewhere? No, of course not.
Market it to investors, raise money, buy assets, improve them, flip them for a profit, and then distribute the profits out to investors.
They always make it
again,
worse.
In theory. If this
the improvement is just in shitification.
Goes well, the firm can usually launch multiple different funds all at the same time each with their own vintage, which is again just a douchey finance bro way of referring to the year the fund was launched. So to really stretch the lingo, the PE firm is the winery and the PE funds are the barrels, which are again supposed to be used up within a set time period. Now, that
Yeah. No, they're usually segmented by years or by asset class.
self-imposed timeframe exists for a reason. In theory, it forces managers to actually sell their companies and realize returns, rather than just keeping a portfolio on the books, claiming it's worth billions, and charging a 2% management fee on that hypothetical number indefinitely. Again, in theory, it forces them to prove what their holdings are actually worth, which was also a part of the reason why 2025 saw such an uptick, because a lot of the vintages were expiring. But when there are just not that many buyers and the self-inflicted clock is ticking, it creates some perverse incentives.
Everybody's run out of money. They don't have any more money. Elucidator, welcome in. How do you hope the Saturday is treating you well? Yeah, not too bad. Better now that I'm here.
The industry has started reluctantly building workarounds. Continuation vehicles are where a fund sells a company to a new fund run by the same manager. Evergreen funds that never technically expire, and net asset value loans where funds borrow against their own reported portfolio values to pay distributions to investors in the meantime. It's more
Wait. Go back. Hang on. What?
against their own reported never technically expire, and net asset value loans where funds borrow against their own reported portfolio values to pay distributions to investors in the meantime.
They borrow against their own valuations to pay investors. No, that is madness. Any other investment vehicle, any other sort of publicly traded company, if this was discovered, it would be the end of them. You can't do that. That is not sustainable. They are borrowing and borrowing in the hopes that they'll be able to eventually pay it back. And I will bet you anything they have no strategy, no real viable strategy to figure out how to get to that point where they can just pay their investors back with the money they made. But also, oh, look at that, we've also got to service these debts over here. They are trying to pay investors now with tomorrow's money. It's not going to work. And these sort of evergreen investment vehicles, whatever the fuck they call them, this is just, they're trying to keep it going. And it's like, no, ride's over. Get off.
It's more extend and pretend that has sort of been enabled by slightly lower rates and much looser oversight. And look, I'm trying to be more positive about things, so maybe this is all to say that the industry wasn't exactly dying. It was in the process of changing, although not necessarily for the better. But that was 2025. 2026 is shaping up to be a very different year. So it's time to learn how money works to find out if private equity can just go ahead and collapse already. This video is sponsored by Monarch.
Please.
Monarch is a private, ad-free personal finance platform that brings all your accounts into one clean dashboard. It automatically tracks your instead of just and make ads and using Monarch and investments sync from over 13,000 of total money clarity. Now, it's probably worth repeating in all of these videos that private equity is an extremely broad term. All it really means is any investment not listed on public stock markets.
It just sounds like banks lending out their customers' money in their accounts to use on investments to make money back to pay the bank's expenditures and keeping the accounts open. Yeah, a massive shell game.
Typically, this means private non-listed companies, but these days it more broadly means anything from non-listed real estate investments all the way to things like music royalties and even video game IP. If there is something that generates a cash flow, there will probably be a PE firm there to speculate on it. Normally when people talk,
and oftentimes they speculate on things that a lot of other companies out there, they, especially in the realm of publicly traded and whatever, they can't touch it because it is too speculative. It is considered too risky.
About private equity, particularly in the context of the harm it does, they are talking about buyout funds. These are the ones that go and acquire local businesses, load them up with debt, try to cut costs, and flip them for a profit a few years later.
You know you're in for a bad time because they load them up with debt. That to me just sounds like vandalism. It is vandalism of a small enterprise.
This kind of private equity is indeed not doing well. The number of new funds raising money in this space has effectively halved. They have underperformed the regular stock market over the last several years, and they are running out of small to medium businesses willing to sell. So the actual growth in...
Yeah, because they've hoovered them all up already. It just... No, it's not working. They've run out of things to buy. They already own most of the bloody world, so it just at some point there are no worlds left to conquer.
PE broadly has mostly come from somewhere else entirely. Large funds buying large companies, often by specifically taking them off the stock market in a process called going private, which, as you might have been able to piece together, is the opposite of going public. That $55 billion EA deal is an extreme example, but the trend is much broader than that. Wealthy individuals and institutions already own most of the stock market, and these same groups are allowed to invest in private equity. In the past, I have often repeated the statistic that the top 10% of households own 93% of the stock market. That is actually not true anymore. Today, it's down to only about 87%. The top 1% has also fallen from controlling 52 to 50%. Now, on the surface, this might look like a step in the right direction, making asset ownership more equitable, even if it is still very top-heavy. In reality, what has actually happened is that these groups have just transitioned into private markets that regular investors don't have access to. If you look at all financial assets...
Yeah, they got tired of playing by the rules of publicly traded companies, got tired of having to report so many things, and just said, yeah, we're just going to take everything private. That way we can do whatever the fuck we want behind the scenes, and nobody's going to hassle us over any of that.
Including these gated private markets, it is in fact more concentrated than ever. So for a lot of companies, the only real reason to go public anymore is if there's enough retail hype around the business to get them a better price than they could negotiate privately. A lot of companies have figured out it's just easier to sell in private markets. They can avoid the regulatory overhead of being publicly listed and still...
and there is a lot of overhead. There's a reason companies, if they want to go public, they go to these large investment banking firms to do it, because that's what they specialize in, is taking companies public. But there's a lot of work that goes into that. It's not easy, and it doesn't always work out the way these companies want it to.
Raise the same amount of money from the same institutional investors anyway. Which means that a lot of PE funds have basically become glorified index funds filled with boring, conservative businesses that would have previously gone onto the S&P 500 or the Russell 2000. Now, that's probably not great for the average retail investor.
No,
because it means that more of the public stock market is going to be filled with either mega-cap tech companies that already have huge index weights, or companies that are only going public because they know retail hype will get them better pricing than they could in private markets. Put another way,
if you're buying something on hype rather than fundamentals, you are begging to lose your money. You are begging to lose your money.
If a company could sell itself for a higher price to sophisticated institutional investors who spend months doing due diligence, there should probably be a pretty good reason why they'd choose to instead sell that valuable asset to you. Major institutional investors are naturally wary of stretched valuations in mega-cap tech. So if they want broad exposure to companies outside of that space, private markets have kind of become the place to do it. And well, even if they do want the exposure, it's also worth pointing out that a huge amount of recent deal value in PE has come from financing data center construction or buying the land to build them on.
Again with the data centers. Again with the data centers. It's kind of like that's the only thing that's, really driving the economy at this point, is just who can build the biggest data centers and how fast they can do it. Everyone has a right to issue his own money. Not everyone has the power to make it valuable. Indeed. I mean, Americans really don't like it when you try to provide a competitive alternative to the dollar. Just ask Muammar Gaddafi about that.
Which helped drive up the headline numbers, but is again not really what most people picture when they hear private equity. So if we are being generous, my predictions of their imminent demise had been greatly exaggerated, outside of one particular niche. It has instead mostly been replaced with a private stock market for rich people as opposed to the, public stock market for rich people. The traditional leveraged buyout model is shrinking and struggling. It sounds good, but it gets better. But even for the investors on the inside, there's still a growing problem. A lot of the money that made all of this possible is starting to dry up. We have already made a video about it, but in brief, private credit funds stepped into the gap left by banks after 2008. Offering riskier but higher interest rate loans to companies that couldn't get traditional financing. And for a while, that worked well, especially when rates were lower. But when rates went up and stayed up, a lot of these borrowers found themselves stacking new debt on top of old debt just to keep up with their interest payments.
Yeah, a lot of that was probably variable interest rate products that are tied to whatever the interest rate is at the time. And if interest rates go up, yeah, you're fucked. It's sort of like people before the financial crash in '08, people who bought real estate or bought their homes with adjustable rate mortgages, which, you know, sometimes is all right if you're not going to live in the house for very long, or if you can get it converted over to a traditional mortgage after a time.
Exactly what
But interest rates go up, all of a sudden that housing payment, that mortgage payment every month, all of a sudden that becomes not so affordable anymore.
happened with Medallia. A lot of these private credit loans were packaged into CLOs, collateral loan obligations, which is basically the same concept as the collateralized debt obligations from 2008, except instead of home loans underneath them, they're backed by corporate debt. Now, just a few weeks ago, a CLL tranche managed by Bain Capital defaulted for the first time in Europe since the global financial crisis. Now, to be fair, a junior CLO tranche defaulting is literally what the risk structure is designed for. The junior tranches absorb losses so their senior tranches stay protected. That is the whole point. But it also does sound familiar, right? Fitch has suggested this might not stay isolated, and that this could be the first of a small cluster rather than a one-off. On the retail side, investors have been trying to pull...
Oh, interesting. The little snowflake that starts rolling down the mountain, and then before long you've got a whole avalanche.
Their money out of private credit funds about as fast as their agreements will allow. In Q1 2026, 5 of the 6 major private credit funds gated investor withdrawals to effectively stop the private equivalent of a run on the bank. Non-listed BDCs returned about $7 billion to investors during the quarter while only raising $5 billion, marking the first time these private credit vehicles saw more money going out than coming in. Across the entire industry in the first half of 2026, deal volume dropped 34% compared to 2025, with the total number of PE transactions down 67%. Which, in my defense, means I wasn't wrong about the industry so much as I was wrong about the timing, which...
Being too far ahead of your time is indistinguishable from being wrong, so... Yeah, that's always kind of the thing, is that you're either, you know, especially if you've got an instinct for these sorts of things, you're usually either right or you're just right far ahead of schedule. But for so many normies and idiots out there, if you're too far ahead of your time, you're just wrong. I don't know if I agree with that. I think you're just way ahead of your time. So fuck you, Howard Marks.
Which I guess is basically the same thing. Anyway, there are 2 other external variables that have contributed to this boom and bust. The first is that a lot of funding for these private
It's better to be right super early than to be wrong.
markets came from countries in the Persian Gulf. In the past, they had been using their oil revenue to make major acquisitions across a range of industries. But obviously, this year their revenue has been cut off. So this particular source of new funding has been a lot slower on top of an already shrinking market. The second thing is that one of the biggest target industries for broader private equity has been having its own problems. Over the past decade, PE firms really liked software as a service businesses because they were relatively capital light and they worked well when rolled up together with other similar companies to expand their product suites. So instead of a SaaS company selling one product, they could become a portfolio of companies selling in one solution.
Yeah, don't use Adobe. Chat. Don't use any of this. It's all a rip-off. And their programs are shit. Go with something open source. Fuck Adobe.
Mostly as big software packages targeted at other businesses. Again, to use the recent example, Thoma Bravo was one of the biggest players in this space, and Medallia was just one of the dozens of similar holdings they had previously acquired. But 2026 has not been a kind year for SaaS companies. A lot of businesses have started to believe they can now vibe code workable alternatives to the enterprise software they've been paying annual subscriptions for.
Vibe coding, really? You think you can vibe code your way to success? Yeah. Nah, that's not how any of this works.
And even if that's not actually true for most companies yet, investors think it is. And that's what matters for
Well, they think wrong.
Valuations. The industry is calling it the SaaS apocalypse. Roughly $1 trillion in aggregate SaaS market capitalization was erased in Q1 of 2026 alone. The median public SaaS company revenue multiple fell from 6.2x at the end of 2024 to 3.3x by March 2026. Of course, private companies don't get constantly updated pricing information until they are forced to sell or be foreclosed on. Secondary market buyers are now demanding discounts of 20% or more to take SaaS-heavy PE portfolios off managers' hands, up from around 5% just a few weeks before that.
They want things to go on sale, 20% off.
This is why Thoma Bravo decided to hand Medallia over to its creditors. In theory, it had $5 billion in equity, but after these adjustments, it was underwater on its loans, even with a very modest leverage ratio. So it just made more sense to walk away and record the loss. Bravo's general partner, Mr. Bravo himself, said at a conference shortly after, "We were moving really fast during that time. We underwrote really fast growth, and in hindsight, we paid too much because that growth didn't materialize." Now, I know that this is just one example, but it is a big one, and probably the first of many to be exposed pantsless as
Paid too much for something, and now you can't make the money back. Some of these people, man, they just, it's like they forgot what buy low, sell high is all about.
the tide goes out. According to an industry report from Oliver Wyman, 80% of PE buyers now cite AI-driven commoditization as the #1 risk to SaaS valuations. Now, the other thing about all of this is that we genuinely don't know how good or bad things really are. Yet. The private credit industry is private.
Well, I mean, when the whole thing finally does crash and burn, we'll know. Thing is anyone going to go to jail? Probably not. No one really went to jail for what happened with the '08 financial crisis, did they? Last time we ever got any sense of justice was people at Enron and WorldCom going to prison.
Closures are few and far between. We can only estimate what's actually going on based on the rare moments things go so publicly wrong that they become impossible to hide, or from the handful of metrics that do get reported. Now, to be fair, private equity becoming a boring walled garden of equally boring companies only accessible to accredited investors would actually be preferable to the old model of leveraged buyout funds strip mining local businesses. But more broadly, the market can stay irrational longer than any fund can stay solvent, or some dumb YouTuber can maintain their ego. But there is one element to this that won't wait around. We've mentioned it briefly, but go and watch this video next to find out how private credit might bring the find out stage sooner than would otherwise be expected. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.
I mean, people keep borrowing money until they can't, and if they're doing it for irresponsible things, it's going to catch up with them. You can only borrow for so long before people won't lend you any more money.